All right. Well, we certainly know that people will start joining us as we continue on, and as we always know with these events, with residents' busy schedules and attendings' busy schedules, the real value is in the fact that we can offer this as an on-demand broadcast. So whether you're joining us live or we're coming to you in the future, glad that you're able to join us for this presentation. We have with us Dr. Chadwick Williams, who is joined us, and he was kind enough to send along a little bio. So just for those of you who haven't had the opportunity yet to meet Dr. Williams, he's a gastroenterologist and inflammatory bowel disease specialist at the Dartmouth General Hospital. Dr. Williams completed his Bachelor of Science and Medical degrees here in Dalhousie prior to leaving to complete his internal med residency and gastroenterology residency at the University of Calgary. Dr. Williams completed an inflammatory bowel disease fellowship at the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Currently holds faculty appointments at DAL and MUN, and is a member of several organizations, including the Royal College, the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology, and the American Gastroenterology Association. Dr. Williams currently the internal medicine site lead and the endoscopy site lead at the Dartmouth General Hospital. And Dr. Williams is the current chair of the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Subcommittee. And we've had the pleasure of having Dr. Williams host a talk for us. I believe it was 3 years ago now, Dr. Williams, 2 or 3. And we're certainly glad to have you back with us again today to talk about an important topic for certainly all of us and for our membership, which represents a diverse group of resident physicians. We're very pleased to have you join us today. And I'm going to hand the reins over to Dr. Williams for his presentation. We'll ask everyone just to stay on mute for now, and we'll have a nice Q&A at the end with any questions. And without further ado, Dr. Williams, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Daniel, and thanks to Mardocs, Leanne, for reaching out again and asking me to do this. I love any interaction or any chance I get to interact with trainees, residents in particular. And you're right, Daniel, it's been a few years. It was actually 2021 that I last gave this talk. Very similar subject matter. I've changed slides around slightly, and there's some new experiences that have come up since then. But yeah, I'm super honored to be able to come and do this again. So I'll just start sharing my screen here, bring up the presentation for you. And I'll put it into presentation mode. It looks okay there. I'm just going to go into presentation mode. Yep, thumbs up. Okay. And I'm going to minimize your pictures so I can see my full screen. So Daniel, I may lean on you a bit. If there's any burning questions or hands that come up in the meantime, just interrupt me, please, and I'll stop and answer them. Otherwise, we can deal with questions certainly at the end, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. And a great reminder there, Dr. Williams, if people do want to use the raise hand function, that'll probably be the best way to keep this as a nice sort of organized conversation this evening. So back to you, Dr. Williams.
Great. Thank you very much. So the topic is around racism in medicine. And I've kind of titled it From East Preston to Medical Faculty. East Preston's my hometown. It's just on the outskirts here of HRM. So it's going to talk about my kind of medical career journey. The picture here is actually a picture from a river very close, right next to, adjacent to the community church in East Preston. And it's where traditionally they would do the baptism. So you see all of these individuals in white garbs. Those are who we call candidates. And they're getting baptized in the water to signify new life through Christ. So it's just, I'll talk a bit about the church as we go on, because I think it's pertinent a bit to some of the subject matter, not for the religious stuff, but more to talk about the importance of it to community. Before I go any further, though, I do want to acknowledge where we're at. This is Mi'kma'ki, and we should always take time to acknowledge that these lands where we work, live, socialize, and profit are in Mi'kma'ki, and they are the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik people. And the term unceded is important. It indicates that the Mi'kmaq did not give up their rights to their land or resources despite colonization. And this territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. Also, I need to recognize that Nova Scotia is the birthplace of African presence in Canada. African Nova Scotian history goes back 400 years prior to Confederation, prior to actual Canada, and to the earliest years of what we have come to know or call Nova Scotia. We are a distinct founding culture and have contributed structurally, professionally, socially, artistically, architecturally, and culturally to this province, and we remain a key part of Nova Scotia. So a couple of disclaimers and disclosures before I go ahead. I don't have any financial disclosures that are pertinent to this talk. The experiences that I'll talk about are mine, but they're not necessarily unique to me. And I certainly have other colleagues who share similar experiences, and they may even be from different backgrounds or walks of life, but there are parallels for sure. I use the terms Black, African descent, African Canadian, African Nova Scotian kind of interchangeably. I'm not one that's stuck on any particular nomenclature. So pardon me if you prefer one and you see me using another. And this is meant to be interactive. There is certainly ample time at the end of the talk for questions and comments. But if you do have any burning questions prior to that, please interrupt and I will answer them. So these are the objectives. I'm going to discuss some of the challenges that I've experienced when choosing and pursuing a career in medicine. I hope to identify some race-based obstacles to succeeding in medical school and residency, and then discuss challenges of what I found with regard to being Black faculty of medicine. I'll also talk a bit about code switching and how it's both helped and hurt me through my medical journey. So I'm a physician, a clinician, and you might wonder, well, where does this guy get the chops to talk about these things? And I didn't really seek it out, but lots of things changed just a few years ago, as you'll recall. And one of those things was a huge upswelling and kind of recognition worldwide, but especially here in North America around race and how race affects many of our institutions. And a lot of this came to light around some very, very important happenings in court cases in the US. For me, I remember back in June 2020, it was around lunchtime. There's a physician's lounge that I used to frequent quite a bit more at DGH. And we would sometimes rub shoulders with other clinicians from other divisions. And this was a hospitalist that I was sitting down with. And we would frequently be in the lunchroom together and talk. And we were talking about a lot of things. This was around the time of, Ahmaud Arbery being killed, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and of course, the very, very well-known George Floyd murder. And my colleague, who happens to be white male, Scottish background, asked if I had ever experienced systemic racism, because he was very troubled by all of these happenings, and it was quite new information for him. So he wanted to know if it had ever affected me directly, and asked if I had ever experienced racism when interacting with law enforcement or in medicine. And he was really amazed when I told him absolutely that I had. And I was kind of amazed that he was amazed. I was thinking, how could you not know that that's something that's happening? So it was pretty clear that whilst we were both physicians working in the same institution at the same site, taking care of the same patients, we actually experienced our environments very differently, and maybe didn't recognize how differently those experiences were from one to another. I'll get back into that in a little bit, but a little more background about me. So I'm a son of Preston. Preston's actually technically broken up into two Prestons. So there's East Preston and North Preston. They're geographically connected, or right next to each other, but they're also very distinct, and there's some friendly competition between the two. My mom happens to be from North Preston and my dad is from East Preston, so that's always brought about some interesting household jokes and some friendly rivalry. But it is the oldest and largest Black community in Canada. It's established back in the 1700s. It's inhabited by descendants of two groups, really. So previously enslaved Africans, but some of those were Jamaican Maroons. So those are previously enslaved Africans who revolted in Jamaica or prior to the ships reaching Jamaica. revolted against the slave ship owners and basically took over Jamaica. But some of them weren't happy in Jamaica and left to go north to what is now North Preston. And then there's another group called the Black Loyalists. So those are folks who escaped slavery, joined the British Army, and many of them actually went to the UK for a time, but weren't happy in the UK. They were free Black people, and they immigrated from the UK to what is now mostly East Preston. As I mentioned, these groups are closely related, but they are distinct communities. They have their own churches. They have similar but still somewhat different traditions, and even the language is slightly different. Obviously, it's English, but the dialects are slightly different, and it's kind of cool. If you really want to know more about Preston, I don't know how many of you have been to Preston, but the best way to find out about Preston is to go to the church, and it doesn't matter if you're Christian or some other faith. I would go just for the pure entertainment value of going to the church. It's a bit of a spectacle, and it's a lot of fun, even if you are from a different faith or a belief system. If you do go, a couple of things. Eat before you go. Big breakfast. Church is long. So my parents were out to North Preston Church for a service a couple of weeks ago, and church started at 11 and ended at around 3:30. So yeah, you have to eat or else you will be very hungry. Stretch. It's a bit of a mild HIIT workout. There's not a whole lot of sitting. There's a lot of squats because you're sitting in the pew and you stand up. You're up and down the whole time. There's a lot of clapping, maybe even some jumping, and a lot of singing. And dress for it. It is like the Kentucky Derby there. So it's a no denim zone. People are dressed to the nines, lots of shiny shoes, huge hats. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. And they love visitors. So if you go, they will certainly ask you to stand up. They'll make a big spectacle of having a visitor there, and they really celebrate them. Little known fact about me. So as a kid, I actually wanted to be a vet. I loved science and biology. I love animals, but I learned that I'd really be better suited to treating humans than animals. So medicine was really kind of the natural choice for me. And I knew that fairly early on in my life, and my parents obviously supported that. But there were some challenges with choosing medicine as a career. And this is a short list that I've chosen here because I'm going to talk about each of these. There's certainly a socioeconomic or wealth gap. It's a whole other discussion. I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot, except to say that it's a problem. And if you take, for instance, the community that I was just talking about, Preston, and you think about the many Black families that have lived there for, as I said, since the 1700s, there are big plots of land there that people have their homes on. But one of the problems is many of those individuals actually don't have deed or title to that land, even though that land has been in their family for hundreds of years. They don't have title to it. And that's a big legal problem. And there are people that are working very hard to change that now. But if you don't have legal title to the land, it makes it very difficult to use your land as collateral and to gain wealth, to send your kids to school, so to get loans for anything. So this has been a big problem: generational wealth, socioeconomic wealth gap. There's also this racialized academia. I will talk about that in a moment, and then lack of representation. So with regard to racialized academia, we talk about race being a determinant of many types of outcomes, including health outcomes. But what maybe we don't think about or talk about so much is how race can be a determinant of education received. So there are lots of data around this, most of it from the US, but some of it from Canada as well, showing that Black students are disproportionately disciplined and suspended in school, even when the infractions are similar to those committed by non-Black students. Blacks are more likely to be directed into non-STEM programs, so programs that are not science or tech or engineering or mathematic kind of oriented, more kind of trades. And this actually, I was going to say here, this is the next bullet point. These are data that I was talking about. There are lots of data around this. around these things. But I also have firsthand knowledge of these. So there are many friends and family of mine. And actually, when I was making this presentation several years ago, I showed it to my mom. I actually practiced it with them because I knew they'd be interested in it. And when I came to this slide, my mom piped up and she said, "Oh, you mean like what happened to you?" She's talking about me. And I asked her what she was talking about. And then she informed me that when I was in grade school, so very early on in elementary school, even though I was doing really, really well with all of my scholarly activities, usually, at or near the top of the class, one of the teachers, or it was actually the guidance counselor, pulled my parents aside at one of the parent-teacher nights and told them that Chad's also really good with his hands. You should try and steer him more towards doing a trade, and maybe, don't have him waste time on these other kind of higher end scholarly things. Obviously, my parents were not very impressed with that advice, and they didn't follow through with it, thank goodness. But this has happened and continues to happen even now. When I was in med school and when I was in my later years of undergrad at Dal as well, I had the opportunity to work in the North End at a tutoring program, which was predominantly Black kids from the inner city in Halifax. And there I saw the same thing. So lots of really, really talented Black minds, but they were often being kind of steered or encouraged to do other types of things that weren't going to challenge them or have them go down these STEM type programs. So there are folks who are working to change this, and there are even more people now. This article is from 2021, so it's already fairly dated. But here we have Charlene Grant, who is on the left there. She identified academic streaming and over-policing of Black students and withholding of supports in schools, and has been working towards remedying that. The gentleman on the right is Mr. D. Tyler Robinson. Similar, and this is, I believe he's based out of Ontario, but recognize that racism is systemic. So the response in schools needs to be systemic. We need a broad-based approach, K through 12, that systemically looks to deconstruct this problem. And the lady in the middle is a previous university colleague of mine and family friend of ours. So this is Principal Karen Hudson. She's actually principal at one of the Dartmouth high schools, Auburn High. And when she took over, probably about, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago now, 9 years ago, she noticed that there was a disproportionate underrepresentation in higher level university prep courses of Black students. So there were less of them compared to the non-Black students in these courses. And she wanted to change that. And so what they did is they developed a science and math program that incorporated and acknowledge African heritage and contributions to the sciences and math in history. And that actually ended up resulting in higher uptake and higher throughput of Black students through these STEM programs. There's also this lack of representation that I was talking about. So lack of Black faces in medicine is a real problem. So, oftentimes I get these questions: do you really need representation in order to support diversity and culturally competent medicine and medical care? Well, for me, I think if you can see it, then you can be it. But what if you don't see it? And for me, that was a big problem. So when I was thinking about a career in medicine, I didn't know of any Black physicians. I had never seen one. And it caused me to question a lot of things. So I wondered if that was something that I could do or not. And why was it that there were no Black physicians in a province that has quite a few Black people? Is there something about being Black that makes you not able to do medicine? Is there something about that institution that is making sure that there aren't any Blacks in medicine? These are all the questions that came to a young mind at the time. Regardless, I think certainly back then it resulted in very few and in some scenarios no Black students considering medicine as an option. And I think the times are changing now. This is another example of this. And this example is something that resonated with me. So this is the story of Dr. Chika Arua from 2020. So she was the only Black med student in the class of 2020 of U of T. So, huge class, 259 students in Canada's largest city. And although I told you, Preston is the oldest largest kind of Black community. Certainly, Toronto has more Black people in it than East Preston does by many fold. So lots of Black folks in Toronto, one Black student in about 260. And she recognized that there were some significant challenges, and this excerpt from this article kind of outlines that. So Dr. Arua was taught early that she had to do more, be much more than the competition, and leave nothing to chance, because the odds were not in favor of a little Black girl with kinky hair, African features, and an ethnic name, and parents who talked funny. I think that Canadian med schools, I know that Canadian med schools are doing a lot to address this. And again, these articles here and these citations are dated now 4 years, and a lot's happened in 4 years. Here I was talking about several med schools, and one of them was my GI and internal medicine alma mater, University of Calgary. But certainly here, locally, there's been a lot of work done at Dalhousie as well with Dean Anderson. One of my GI colleagues, Dr. Ian Epstein, has been a real mover and shaker with regard to initiatives to try and improve diversity with regard to residency program admissions for GI, but also more broadly than that. So we are trying to make changes, and I think they are working, but there's still a lot of work to be done in this regard. Now, some folks will say, "Well, Chad, it can't be that bad. I mean, you did it. Others should be able to do it also, just like you did." And I mean, I think it's true that I've done it, but that's a bit of a misleading statement, because it's not as if race and racism hasn't affected my path and my choices, and things could have been very much different for me. Certainly, it's affected my well, I almost didn't do medicine, first of all, because of some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. The choice of program, I'm very happy as a gastroenterologist, but I must tell you that going through med school and residency, I did, as many residents do, think about a lot of things. And when you rotate through different rotations, you kind of try and see yourself doing that particular subspecialty. And there was at least one subspecialty program that was, at the time I was going through, even at Dal, that was well known not to want Black applicants. And that was well known. And, there wasn't really a great way to address it, or, residents at the time didn't have a great avenue to address that. And then, when I think about how I did get to where I'm at, it wasn't by myself, and I think there was some luck as well. So I had two really strong grandmas who really were invested in me doing this, and they were very firm in their religious beliefs that it was just going to happen. And I had brutally honest parenting, similar to Dr. Arua, that story that I told you about from U of T. So my parents often told me that you'll need to do better to get the nod. You're not going to get the benefit of the doubt that some of your peers may get. So don't mess up. I also had some good fortune. So I was able to get into a program that's called Shad Valley. It was right after secondary school, prior to going into university. And that program did give me some connections that I wouldn't have otherwise had, including a connection with Dr. Ren Holness. Dr. Ren Holness is no longer practicing, but he was a well-known now retired neurosurgeon in Halifax, but he's also Jamaican, and he's the first Black physician that I had ever met. So after I met him, I was pretty certain I was going to do neurosurgery, until I actually got into the neurosurgery OR and realized this is not for me. But meeting him was something that was very, very important for me to do, and certainly showed me and confirmed to me that I could be a physician as well. And I had a really good mentor in Dr. Margaret Casey, who happens to be a family physician, who's still doing some work, but is really slowed down quite a bit. But she's been a huge advocate and supporter of diversity in medicine for many, many years. And after a certain point, I think once you get into med school, start spending money to pay the bills and pay for courses, and certainly once you're in residency, there is no turning back. There's a fear of failing, and there's the option of not finishing is a non-option. So there was that as well. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about race-based obstacles to succeeding in medical training. Again, there's this lack of representation that I talked about, but there are certainly biases, both explicit and implicit, that we should talk about. I've talked already a bit about the lack of representation, but with regard to succeeding through medicine, I think it's important that the lack of Black attendings and medical teachers was a problem for me. I mean, I'm a self-confident person, but it did question me. It did cause me to question my place in the medical institution and in the class even. And it developed certainly a bit of an imposter syndrome, maybe even more of one than some of my colleagues would have had. Also, it was really difficult to know how to address or manage racism in my training. Whether it be from colleagues or from patients, is it wise or even safe to bring it up? Sometimes it felt like maybe it would be better to just ignore it and not bring it up at all, not cause any waves. And it was hard to identify who you could speak to or give this information to, who would be able to give you advice on this if they didn't have these similar experiences. So with regard to biases, thankfully, explicit bias is less commonly seen in medicine, but it is there. So I mentioned that there are sometimes programs that are just very blatant about it. And that certainly happened during my tenure. We knew about it. More recently, there's been news reports about other instances as well. And I think those are things that are being addressed. Well, what about with patients and peers voicing views around, for instance, affirmative action type programs, and presuming that if you're in the program that you're in it because there have been some allowances made for you to get to this level, and not getting there on your own merit. And then there's microaggressions from patients, colleagues, faculty. It's not infrequent that I'll get asked this question, and it's difficult to know how to address it sometimes. So, where are you from? You answer and they say, no, where are you really from? Because you couldn't possibly be from here. You speak so well or you're very articulate. So those things are not super common, but sometimes it's just obvious. And I don't know how many of you would have heard about this story from around 2020. This is out west, Grand Prairie, Alberta. And this was it was a big news story. There was a white surgeon who was originally from South Africa working in Grand Prairie. And what he did was he hung a noose on the OR door of one of his Black colleagues who was operating in that room. This was back in 2016. But it wasn't actually, it was reported in real time. Nothing happened to it. And in 2020, Dr. Carrie Collius, who happens to be a good friend of mine, who was working in that hospital at the time, she was very overwhelmed by all the happenings, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and thought back 4 years ago when this happened. And she thought, you know what, I think this doesn't sit right with me. I'm going to open this up again. I witnessed it. I'm going to blow the whistle on it. So she did. And what happened was a huge tribunal because there were multiple witnesses to this particular instance. And at the time, they were having difficulty concluding whether or not there was any racist intent and whether there was any malice here at all. So I'll come back to it because this story has been completed. But at that time, they were just looking into it. They said that it was unprofessional behavior, but they hadn't really weighed in with regard to whether it was racist or not. And there was an appeal pending. This is just a quick shout out to Carrie. She's a bit of a right fighter. She went on to do ortho, pediatric ortho in Australia, even though I tried to convince her to do internal medicine. I told her that her notes, I was her senior resident, by the way, in University of Calgary. I told her that her notes were far too detailed and lengthy to not do internal medicine, but she proved me wrong. But she's the one that actually blew the whistle on this particular case, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. This is just another example of explicit bias. You'll remember that Dr. Chika Orua, who I was talking about earlier, this is an excerpt from one of her trips when she was an undergrad at McMaster University, and she was traveling with a few of her classmates who happened to be Asian classmates. So they were in New York doing a shopping trip, preparing to write the critical medical school exam, the MCAT. And they were in great spirits approaching the US border. I'm always very anxious when I approach the US border, by the way. And after the regular questions, the students were they talked to the officer and they were preparing to leave. But one of the officers Oh, sorry. They were explaining to the officer that they were med students, and the officer leaned into Dr. Arua, who wasn't a doctor then, but said, "Even you? Are you also, pursuing med school?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And he questioned her again, "Really?" And she says it was as if he was trying to catch me in a lie. A Black woman and medicine, that couldn't be possible. And she was at a heightened state. The realization of police violence against black bodies was coming to her mind, and she didn't really know how hard to push back, and found that she was in, a bit of an impossible and intimidating position. So implicit bias, though, is far more common, and I also think far more problematic, partly because it's unconscious. So the person who's doing it might not even, often doesn't even notice it. It's very common, and it has more wide-reaching effects. So it can be more difficult to identify and remedy. And it comes in many forms. So you can think of admissions boards, inclusion and involvement at decision-making tables, opportunities for advancement and promotion, and then even complaints against physicians. And by that, an example would be, even though here in Nova Scotia, Black physicians make up a very tiny minority of all physicians, of the physician pool, the majority of high-end, serious complaints from patients are against Black physicians. And that's been recognized as a big problem by the college, to the point that the college actually called a task force to try and get a better understanding of what was going on, because they didn't feel that what was going on was that Black physicians were actually doing more egregious acts. They felt that there was something wrong with the process. There are lots of data around how racial bias affects decision-making in med school admissions and residency admissions. This is perhaps one of the most highly quoted ones. In fact, one of my colleagues from GI utilized this very paper just last week for grand rounds for GI. So Dr. Quinn Capers is actually a cardiologist, cardiovascular surgeon. But at the time of this study, so back in 2017, he was also the dean of admissions for Ohio State University Med School. And what he recognized through doing implicit bias testing was that their admissions board had a high level of implicit racial bias that actually had a white preference. And that was including in the faculty. And many of those individuals were shocked, because this is much of this was implicit bias, unconscious bias. So they were shocked that they had these biases. And what they were able to do afterwards is work with people to help them try and identify these biases, if they were going to stay on these decision-making tables. And after they did that, the very next year, actually, they had more diversity in their intake with regard to med school admissions than they'd had during any of the previous years. Interestingly as well, this study also showed there was a significant amount of explicit bias in Ohio State University, which is a whole other thing. So being Black faculty of medicine certainly has unique challenges, but also unique opportunities, I think. So some of the challenges are being heard without being heard to be angry. There can be concern of differential ramifications of error or even perceived error, fear of how concerns or complaints of racism will be addressed. There are expectations, not just from the institution, but also from community. There's privilege and power of advocacy that comes with being a Black physician in this neck of the woods. And then there's also, opportunities for mentorship and role modeling. So I don't know how many of you have heard of this term of code switching, but in the context of Blackness and medicine, I want you to think about, this concept of, being an angry Black man. So voicing a difference of opinion or disagreeing while being Black can be interpreted as anger, intimidation, disruptive, or being difficult. And so oftentimes we find ourselves having to calculate or anticipate or use other strategies to cope, like code switching, which I'll define in a moment, or even enlisting allies, which are often white allies, to help you to try and navigate these. So I'll give you an example, and I won't name any names, but I think it's a good example. So during the COVID pandemic, 2020, when it first happened. Many things changed in medicine. And for gastroenterologists, one of the things that changed that we've continued to do is PPE. So, gowning, gloving, and at that time, obviously masking. We continue to mask throughout the hospitals and visors. I was very concerned because the data were mounting that this virus wasn't just droplet. It was, carried in the air. And despite that, we were doing gastroscopies on our patients with just regular cloth masks and not respirator N95s. So I was at one of these decision-making tables, and I was, pleading the case that we should probably be using N95s or be allowed to use them for these. And I was, shot down quite hard, and because I kept bringing it up and bringing up other angles. And at one point, one of my colleagues who was in a decision-making position over me just said, "Chad, that's enough. We've heard enough from you. Don't bring it up again. We're done." And everybody kind of had wide eyes at that moment, and I felt kind of sheepish, but I didn't talk anymore. But what I did do afterwards is I went to some of my other colleagues who were around that table, who felt similarly, but they didn't look like me. And I asked them to maybe at the next meeting be a bit more vocal, and if they felt similarly to me, maybe they could also put the issue together and put it to the table. So that's what happened. In 1 to 2 weeks, they put this same argument to the table, and it was well received. And the policy was changed to allow us to use the N95s if we felt it was appropriate. So, these are just some of the things. It's just an example, and there are several, but that's one of the examples that I have. So mastering the code switch. So if you look at Wikipedia, code switching means when a speaker alternates between 2 or more languages in the context of a single conversation. So in the broader context, though, being Black while interacting and navigating certain institutions, it's not isolated to language, but also encompasses behavior. So there's the talk. So in my community and culture, the talk isn't the birds and the bees talk. Well, that is a talk, but the other talk is, how do you interact with law enforcement? So this is a talk that many anyway, Black parents have with their Black children, especially Black males, about what you do and what you don't do. If you're driving the car, make sure your wallet is on the dash or somewhere in plain sight. You do not want to have to go into your glove compartment to get the wallet or reach into your pocket to get the wallet. Bad things can happen if you do that. Also, with regard to interviews, making sure that everything, there's no potential for mishaps or errors during interviews. Interaction with patients who may be uncomfortable with Black physicians, so trying to make them feel more comfortable, and sometimes that may mean trying to make them feel more comfortable around a Black physician. And that may be with how you speak to them, that may be with body positioning, that may be with maybe bringing somebody else into the room to make them a little more comfortable as well. And then interactions with colleagues, the workaround. So similar to that experience that I told you about the N95 masks. And this code switching actually isn't usually conscious. It's usually unconscious. I do most of this without even thinking about it. But it can be kind of exhausting because I am often altering who I am depending on the scenario and the environment. I talked a bit about the costs of error or perceived error and how that may be more severe for certain groups, including Black physicians. And as I said, the College of Nova Scotia has already identified this and have done some work with regard to this. And there's actually a task force recommendation for the college that's been published if you wanted to have a look at that. I was part of that. But this is a case out of New Brunswick, actually. So this is the case of Dr. Jean-Robert Ngola. And again, this was around the COVID-19 pandemic. He was living in northern New Brunswick, but had to travel to Quebec for a family emergency to get his daughter. And allegedly, according to him, before he left, he did contact the authorities to make sure that it was okay for him to travel across the border to go get her. And when he came back, in his small northern New Brunswick community, there was an outbreak of COVID-19. And it was never necessarily linked back to his case. But the community there obviously felt differently, and they got very upset and kind of made him out to be, they demonized him really with regard to this COVID-19 outbreak in their community. But that wasn't all they did. They also racially attacked him and made fun of him and his family. And ultimately, he had to leave because he felt unsafe. He did actually ask the premier of New Brunswick for an apology, because Blaine Higgs at the time had said something that wasn't particularly helpful, and the premier refused to apologize. So Dr. Nicola left. So sometimes we also run against this. So, when we know that something's wrong, but we're not sure, or, nobody wants to actually say that it's racist, because that's maybe for some folks a step too far. So getting back to this case of the noose, as you recall, where I left off with it, this South African surgeon had left a noose on the door, an OR door of a Black colleague. And what the tribunal came back with is that it was unprofessional, but they weren't sure that it was racist. Ultimately, what they said at the end was that they couldn't find any evidence of racism at all, so they just called it unprofessional. He had a few weeks off of work, and he's now welcome back. He's been working back, since then. So I think, if a noose on a door isn't racist, a racist symbol, I don't know what is. And if a tribunal of multiple people can't find that, then I think there's problems there. I would tell you that that the makeup of the tribunal is what you might have expected as well. But how can acts of racism be safely acknowledged and addressed in medicine? There are concerns. So the complainants can often be labeled as complainers. And because of that, the complainants often don't complain, because they don't want to be seen as complainers or exaggerators or troublemakers. And they also end up often being the people who suffer in the end, with regard to their careers going in directions that they don't want. So oftentimes these things aren't reported. So this is a little scripture. I told you that both my grandmas were very reverent, and they would often say this: so to whom much is given, much is required. So why do I do this advocacy bit, and why do I talk about these things? Well, I think being one of very few Black physicians, and the only one from my community, makes me an ambassador, makes me an advocate, whether I want to be one or not. So I do things like this for trainees, but I also do similar talks and also activities for youngsters in the community who are anywhere from daycare to elementary to high school, and I find that very, very rewarding, and I think it's really important work. But it does come with some expectations from the community and medical institution alike. And it can be difficult because nobody wants to say, I certainly don't want to say no to that. So we've been looking at ways to try and find, there are other Black physicians, obviously, in Nova Scotia and in Central Zone. So we've been trying to network a bit to try and get a bit more of a group effort towards some of these efforts. And that's been very successful. This role of being a physician certainly allows for advocacy. There's been increased recognition of institutionalized racism and race as a determinant of health worldwide. And I think here we're taking it very seriously as well. Certainly I can speak for my institution, Dartmouth General Hospital. Dartmouth is a bit of a special place. It serves a very diverse community. And the Preston area that I was talking about is very close by to Dartmouth. So that would be the main hospital there. And certainly the leadership at Dartmouth General recognizes that, they value that, and they want to make sure that all patients are comfortable and receive culturally competent care. So there have been many initiatives going on to bring that about at Dartmouth General and to improve that for Black patients, but also for patients who are otherwise in need of equity as well. So other equity deserving groups. And here I just listed some initiatives that have happened and that are happening. So there's the Heart Health Research Program that Dr. Jason Young and Dr. Christine Herman have headed up through, again, DGH, Dartmouth General Hospital, and one of the big banks. There's some work going on with colon cancer screening. One of our previous trainees, Dr. Rachel Sullivan, actually kind of spearheaded some of the data looking into this, and we're hoping on doing some advocacy around this, and even hopefully dropping the age of colon cancer screening, because there's been a recognition, especially in some groups, including Black patients, that the risks of cancer would warrant us screening earlier than age 50. So I'm passionate about being a role model and a mentor for youth. This used to say I'm passionate about being a role model and a mentor for Black youth, but that's not exactly true. It's for all youth. And the reason why I dropped the Black is because, these things, with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the reasons why we need to change it. This isn't a Black problem, and it's not an Indigenous problem. It's a problem that we all have to face, but it's not something that was brought about by these equity-seeking groups. So I think it's really, really important that everybody is involved and everybody shoulders some of this to get some wins here and to improve the system. Plans promoting leadership in health for African Nova Scotians is a big program here that's happening, driven by the Health Association of African Canadians in partnership with Dartmouth General Hospital Foundation and RBC. They've been doing a lot of work, including scholarships for kids from the community, and many other initiatives, field trips at DGH, and I've been involved in some of that. So what it's actually resulted in is many young people from both the Black community and Indigenous communities seeing themselves being able to work in the medical system. And some of those folks are already now enrolled through Dalhousie Med School and other med schools, but this is the most diverse class that Dalhousie has ever had. And the hope is that those folks, after they finish their training, will come right back to institutions like Dartmouth General and work in these institutions and really come about and make our institutions more diverse. We do know that more diverse groups provide better healthcare. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So as I said, diversity in medicine improves. I don't know why they asked this capital there. I think I was making a last-minute edit. The quality of medical training and provision of medicine overall. I think, and I hope my story highlights some of the obstacles and struggles, but it also shows, I hope, a path forward for improvement. And the discussions and decisions moving forward will definitely be difficult. And I think if we're not having difficult discussions, then we're not really talking about the things that we need to. So there'll be difficult discussions, but they will be worth it, and we'll all be better for it. So the last slide is just this Mars rover. So back around 2021 was when this landed on the moon. And I just put this there because if we can put a rover on the moon, we can certainly do a much better job of tackling issues around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion in medicine. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And I've left about 10 minutes, but I'm happy to stay as long as the trainees like.
Great.
The kids are in bed, and I've got all night.
Well, there you go. You're ahead of me in that regard there, Dr. Williams. Anyways, thank you very much for that presentation. Lots of great info there. For all of those who have joined us, if you want to use the raise hand function, if you'd like to ask a question, you guys can just queue up. We did ask in advance if anybody wanted to submit a few questions, and I do have a couple, so we'll go through those quickly first while people decide to raise their hands in our chat. So our first one's from Mohammed, who asked, Dr. Williams, how would you handle unfair evaluation during residency?
Yeah, so that's a really important one. So, I think it depends a bit on the context. So, I would say it depends on where the evaluation's coming from. I would hope that, there'd be an avenue to go to a program director and let them know that you feel that there was an evaluation that's, not squared with actual performance, and that you have concerns that maybe there's some other variables, including, I guess what Mohammed's getting at is, if there's race involved in the evaluation. So, and that happens, let's be honest with ourselves. It's, let's not fool ourselves that, race doesn't play into these things. And that could be explicit or that can be implicit, or both. But I've certainly seen it happen. We've had trainees come through. I've had trainees come through who, because of who I am and because of doing talks like this, they've come to me while they're on rotation with me, and they've shared with me things that have happened even years prior that changed the course of their career. And, it's after the fact that with at least one of them, we actually did dig into it and, actually submitted a bit of a grievance, not because that person actually wanted anybody to, pay for anything, or because they were going to change anything for them, but they wanted that not to happen to somebody else. And I think that's really, really important. So, what I would say to Mohammed is two things. I think, um, and I had a few slides on this. I think the wrong thing to do, and I put wrong, I think the wrong thing to do is nothing. I think doing nothing is not the right thing to do. And I may not have said that before, because as I mentioned in one of my slides, for the individual, maybe doing nothing, if you're going to pass that rotation anyway, maybe doing nothing, not making waves, and, just moving on is actually easier. But the system doesn't change that way. The individuals who are making these, doing these evaluations don't change, and maybe they don't even recognize that that's what they've done. And those quagmires are still left there for trainees who are coming through. So my advice would be find somebody who you think is safe to speak to. Hopefully that's your program director. If it's not, then find somebody else who you do feel comfortable talking to, who may have a bit more power, because this is always the issue, is there's a power differential between trainees and the people who are evaluating you. And that can make it very difficult to object. That can make it very difficult to disagree. And I think we need to have better avenues for that. I hope that answers the question
Yeah,
from Mohammed.
absolutely. And certainly speaking at a function that's hosted by Residents Professional Association, I would certainly hope that they would feel comfortable coming forward to us. That's an avenue that we certainly try to take up the baton for as well. So thank you for that answer. And moving on. Also, I should mention, folks, if you do also just want to type a question into the chat, I can read it out if you're a little microphone shy tonight, no problem there. A couple more from our previous call. Chris asked, "What are some practices that have saved you from minority stress?"
Yeah. Um, you know, I'm still learning. So,
Hmm.
and I'm still, a bit of a work in progress with regard to that. But I think some of the things that um, save me or help me deal with minority stress are some of the things that lots of folks do to help with stress of from various origins anyway. So, uh, I'm going to say some stuff that sounds kind of basic, but it's true. So sleeping is important. Now, residents, sometimes that's not easy, finding time to sleep. My partner, she still tells me that, I can fall asleep within 3 minutes. You have to be able to do that as a resident. So finding time to sleep is important, getting quality sleep. If you are having trouble with that, I think meditating or, even getting an app that helps you with some mindfulness, such that that you can optimize shutting down and turning things off every now and then. I think that's really important. Staying hydrated is important, and not with the sugary, salty stuff, but making sure that you stay hydrated with some good old H2O. Physical activity and getting outdoors, big deal. And that's another thing that residents lack. I certainly lacked during my residency, where toiling away in the emerge all day. The last thing we want to do is go outside, get fresh air. We want to go to bed, or go home, turn on Netflix, catch up on whatever the latest Netflix craze is. But I think getting outside, fresh air, sunlight, those things are all important. Apart from that, I think it's really, really important to detach yourself from the medical institution as often as possible. So whether that's hanging out with friends that are outside of the medical institution, or hanging out with other residents who you have a pact that we're not going to talk about shop, like let's go do something else, go out, grab a coffee, go shopping, go on a hike. I think those are really, really important things to do. And residents are certainly given a certain amount of vacation time. So just making the most and making sure you utilize that as best you can. With regard to the specifics around, kind of the minority, there's these things called like a minority tax and, the minority stress. I think some of that is a bit more difficult. So in my situation, when I think about it, what I think about is when, the community is coming to ask me, Chad, can you do another talk? Or Chad, there are all these events happening and they're all very important and they're important to me, but they all take time. Things like this too. I mean, these things all take time, but they're important. Trying to find avenues to better navigate that. That's what I'm trying to work at. And that's where I'm kind of networking a bit with some of my other colleagues who are also very interested in doing this and trying to kind of share that work. It's very important work.
Mm. I have one more question that was submitted in advance, and we've got one in the chat as well. But I'm going to take a moment to just take a little chair's privilege there. One thing in your presentation that really sort of perked my ears up was when you talked about personally feeling that fear of failing amongst your family, amongst your community, when you're, on the leading edge of affecting this change. Uh, is there anything in addition to the things we just talked about in the last two questions that sort of helped you cope with that, Dr. Williams, or is that just an additional burden that always the first people across the line are going to have to deal with? Because I'm sure lots of people can relate to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's the latter, really. When I think about it, that was just a hard time to
Mm,
go through, and it's just a stress that I just had to manage.
mm,
Because yeah, it wasn't as if it was, me failing would have been one thing, and people
yes.
fail at things, and you move on to the next thing. But because for my community, I was the first one to do that, it was an additional burden because then it wouldn't be just me failing. Then it would be East Preston failing.
Mm,
And then what would that mean for the others that were even thinking about it before? That would, have been crushing. If Chad can't do it, then, what's the point of even trying to do this? So fortunately, things have gone the other way. And, now there's been many other individuals who are applying. One of my cousins is actually now a psychiatrist here in town. She just graduated, or she just finished her residency last year. And then, there's lots of others who see us and, they come through our institutions and we're doing all these events. And, it was just even last month we did one where there were, I think, 15 youngsters who were interested in something in healthcare, whether it's nursing. A lot of them are interested in being physicians and have, grand dreams of doing neurosurgery. I've told them you don't really want to do neurosurgery, but yeah. So, I was actually really, really overwhelmed when I did that. And it was a round table. So there were a couple of physicians or a couple of professionals at each table, and the students would rotate around. And there were 15 of them. And I thought that was really cool. I know they thought it was cool. They had great questions. But for me, I got teary, and I get teary still talking about it, because what I see, and I told them, is that's something that I didn't have. And had I had that, it would have been so, so powerful and
mm,
so impactful. And so I was just so happy for them. And I'm still very happy for them that they're able to have that
mm,
and, anchor into that. So whatever they want to do, they'll be able to look back and say, well, I was in a group with 15 other folks, all these healthcare professionals, all Black faces.
mm.
Yeah, hell yeah, I can do this. So
Yeah.
absolutely I can do this. And then it just multiplies and multiplies. So it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So encouraging. It's a certainly like the rock rolling down the hill, and it takes a lot of trailblazers to get that rock moving. But it's so encouraging to hear some of those positive changes as well. One more that was submitted in advance. It was from Lucy, who's actually on the call with us tonight. So Lucy, feel free to jump in if you want to add any additional details. But Lucy said, "I'd like to hear your thoughts on allyship, as well as on living and working with trauma from racism and discrimination." The second half of that we probably touched on a bit, but certainly allyship is a hot topic, Dr. Williams. Maybe you could talk with us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. So as I said near the end, this isn't a Black problem. This isn't an Indigenous problem. You know, and to be a bit more controversial, but to be honest, this is a colonialism problem. This is a white problem. This is a problem that was created by that um, issue, but it is a problem that affects all of us. So we all own it, and we all have to take some we have to shoulder this and figure this out to make it better for everybody. So, you know, in that regard, getting back to your question, how important is allyship? It's huge because none of this is really going to happen without allyship and a lot of it. And part of that is because of the way the system's built. So the system is built right now based on a lot of biases, as I was saying. And I think until we kind of change what the decision-making tables look like and who's there with regard to race, ethnic background, gender, physical abilities, all of these differences, until we try and make sure that those things are all more diverse, we are going to have some of these struggles. So we have to have allyship in order to help us navigate this, look at these institutions, and see how we can do much better. And there are lots of workshops that are happening. When I think of Gaynor Watson Creed, for instance, at Dalhousie, she's doing a lot of big work and several workshops to try and help us really navigate and better understand what our systems look like, in particular the medical system, and how it needs to be, broken down a bit and reconstructed in a way that's more functional and fair. The second part of the question, what was that again? It was a separate question.
Yeah, living and working with trauma from racism and discrimination.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. What I'd like to say is that I think that that's a big deal. And I think that there needs to be, or there should be, avenues for therapy and counseling, quite honestly. These are things, that most of us who are from, equity deserving communities and groups, we recognize that we've been scarred, or that we've had trauma, but we don't really talk about it so much. Life goes on. You still have to go to work. You have to make the money. You have to see patients, and but the trauma is still there, and it does affect how you do your job, and it does affect how you interact with patients and colleagues and loved ones. But to a large extent, it's not managed. So I don't have a great answer for that, Lucy, other than I think it's an unmet need. I think for those of us who are insightful enough, and that's probably not most of us, we would actually say, hey, I think there's probably something that I need to talk to somebody about. And we do have avenues through Doctors Nova Scotia, for instance, and Mardocs may even have other counseling avenues as well for the residents. Just going to talk to them about investigating some of this and stuff. And a lot of it is stuff that you may have suppressed or may not even recognize until you start talking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Williams.
Yeah. And maybe
Right.
I'll just share one other anecdote with you because
Sure.
it troubles me. And I thought about it. I was going to put it in the presentation, but I didn't, and I didn't know quite how to put it. But, I've sat on other assessment boards for trainees as well. And I'm not going to get into details either, but I do feel that while we are working towards improving things, we have a lot of work to do. And what I've seen, even up until very recently, is trainees getting disproportionately or differential reprimands. So for instance, one trainee showing up late for a session and it's interpreted as that person is disengaged, disinterested, doesn't belong in the program. Another person who looks very much different from that person, same infraction, and the messaging is, well, maybe they woke up late, maybe there's something going on, we should talk to them, there may be some family issues that we're not aware of. And and so uh, in that particular experience, I'm trying to be very careful about how I word it. In that particular experience, I brought it up because I was one of the only non-white folks on the panel. And, lots of folks, I think, were kind of taken aback and they thought about it. And afterwards, there was an email that said, you know what, maybe you're right. Maybe something is happening that we're not aware of. I've since left there because of other issues, but I did have struggles leaving as well because it got even less diverse on the panel since I've left. But, these are things, and I just say it because, Mohammed had a question around evaluations and how do you deal with things differentially. I just want to say it's not in your head. You're not making this up. This stuff happens, and it happens right under our noses to good people who just don't know what they don't know because they're not looking for it. And they don't necessarily see that they may be treating people differently for the same things because they don't look like them. And it's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely important message there for sure. One final call for any additional questions, folks, if you want to raise your hands. I do have one more that was placed into the chat here. Adebola asks, thank you for the insightful presentation. How can one get involved with the PLANS program as a volunteer? Do you have any insight on that, Dr. Williams?
I do. So who's the best person to contact? There are several. What I can do, maybe the easiest way is because I've got several emails from them with contact names, and maybe if I could get Adebola's contact, I could put you in touch with who you need to. It's a great program, and there's lots of different options for volunteering and partnership. For residents, time can be a premium, but they would definitely find something for you to do that would be great and valuable for the young people, but also really rewarding for you.
That's great. So, Adebola, as long as you're okay to the idea, I'll connect you with Dr. Williams after. I have both your emails, so I'll connect you folks after the presentation. I've noticed that my boss has unmuted her mic, so I believe that she may have something to say.
Yeah, I didn't want to take away from anybody else's questions, but just a few, they were questions, but I think you already spoke to them, and I just want to highlight how important they are. I've been in this role for a long time, and I've had a lot of residents come to me with various issues. And listening to some of the things you've been through and some of the things that I know many of our members are going through, residency is such a difficult time with that power differential a little bit more obvious than maybe in other workplaces where people have the option to leave and go find a job elsewhere. When you're a resident, you don't have that luxury. And I think that so many residents just don't want to cause trouble, want to put their head down and get through residency. And I think that maybe, we even see it happening more because of that in residency, that in other places where someone might feel a little bit more empowered to speak out, it may be less so in residency. So I think that it's important for us to see that and understand that. And we always try and spread the word that Mardocs is here to help, but recognizing that some of these issues are huge and it does require a resident to come forward and to speak out in order for things to change. And that can be very difficult. I also wanted to point out that I think Dal has come a long way in the last few years with some of the things that we already mentioned around plans. And we have made some changes at Mardocs too that I'm happy about, where we've added a new position to our board, and we're working with plans to have a representative each year. So hopefully there's a lot of baby steps happening for sure around that kind of thing, and I'm happy that we're doing it too. The other thing, a couple of things, there was so much, this was such a good talk, thank you. But the idea of allyship, I think, is really important, and you touched on that, so I won't get into it too much more. But, the idea of us not just talking, of people really becoming involved and standing up. People, but I think I recently attended a workshop, and it was another colleague from the Maritimes who was a part of that, Connie LeBlanc. But it was about allyship, and in it talked about the actions of being and knowing and feeling and seeing and doing and just everything, going all in. So I think that's really important, and each person needs to take that individual responsibility for the people I surround myself with and what actions that I would not be willing to tolerate, and the importance of being involved, and how, you try and pass that on to your colleagues or your families or your children's. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. Those were all such relevant topics, and I appreciate your personal story more than anything. It's very eye-opening when you hear these real stories, and I hope that that gives a little bit of comfort to residents to see that it's good to talk about these things. So thank you very much.
No, no, it's my pleasure, and I think you raised really good points. That point about residents maybe not knowing or feeling comfortable kind of bringing these issues up and addressing them is really important. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that I think when I was a resident, I certainly let more of these things go than address them, because it seemed like the path of least resistance. And I would say that back then, because I wasn't yesterday, I think that back then, maybe that was the right thing to do back then, because there certainly wasn't the infrastructure or the interest or the appetite to talk about any of these things, or to really, there was no value placed on any of this stuff back then. So I don't think it would have been in my favor to bring it up. That's what I think. But nowadays, I think it would be. But I also think that what we need to do, and when I say we, not just not Mardocs necessarily, or DGH, but I think what we need to do in our groups is maybe ask people more, and maybe ask them more in a way that's comfortable and not intimidating. So I think even with our internal medicine group, asking folks or trainees when they come through as part of their rotations, have you felt that there's been any, have you witnessed or seen any discrimination, racism? If you did, would you know how to address it? Do you feel comfortable? Is there somebody that you feel comfortable talking to about that? Whether it's, happened to you or to a patient? I think we, as you say, need to do more than just talk. We need to actually act. And part of that is asking questions and making sure that the resources are available to help people when they need it.
Excellent. Couldn't find my unmute button there for a moment. All right, so we've reached the end of the questions. We've exceeded past the top of the hour, and I think everybody on this call will certainly agree it's time well spent. So before I give Dr. Williams the last word, I will say, just on behalf of all of us, as Sandy just said, just thank you very much, Dr. Williams, for taking time out of your busy schedule. As you mentioned a couple of times through your presentation there, that there is such an importance on mentorship and on leadership and on being that voice that can get the word out. But that is a lot of extra stress and strain and pulls on your time. So we appreciate you making that time for us. We appreciate you speaking to our group, and that we'll be able to put this up on demand for all the folks who couldn't make it tonight, and they can check it out afterwards. So once again, my thanks. And any final thoughts from you as we wrap up tonight, Dr. Williams?
Well, I just wanted to, again, thank you to Mardocs for asking me to present again. It's obviously something that I'm pretty passionate about, and I think there's a huge need. So anytime, I'm happy to come back and talk again to the next crop, and maybe add a few other slides and a few other anecdotes and experiences.
We appreciate it, and we will undoubtedly take you up on that. So thank you very much to Dr. Williams. Thank you very much to each and every one of you for joining us, and we'll talk to you all again soon, and we hope you all have a good evening. Thank you.
Good
Thanks
evening.
very much, everyone.
Thank you.